So, Neil, what do you make of this reopening and really the reaction from markets, as they really don't seem to be that on board that this is going to be a full reopening anytime soon?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so this recent measures that were published by the State Council is a really significant indication that China has moved away from a zero COVID strategy, but it still hasn't moved away from a COVID control policy. I think that might be informing some of the hesitancy here in markets, because this loosening is going to lead to more undetected spread of COVID through the Chinese population at a time when the elderly vaccination rate is still far below the 90+% that Beijing has been targeting. They're trying to make progress on that and reducing the danger to the most vulnerable parts of the population. But this loosening is going to create unpredictability in how COVID spreads. So there's certainly still policy tools available and still policy scope that is left to take some steps back towards further lockdowns and in a targeted manner. We're not going to go back to trying to have zero cases across the country, but if we see some areas of the country under particular strain or experiencing a surge in cases and deaths that's overwhelming public health facilities, then we could certainly see a bit of backtracking in those localities or in certain kind of provinces and areas where that strain is particularly noticeable on the public health and kind of people's safety criteria. But a significant step for sure for the zero COVID policy overall.
Neil, there was always some expectation of an easing of the zero COVID policy, but you could certainly argue that it's been surprising to see how rapidly they've moved on this. Is this really just about the protests, or is there the economic component to it? I mean, what does that tell you in terms of the pace of these changes? What does that tell you about how she is looking at all of this?
I think it's both. I mean, we saw in early November, there were the 20 measures that were the first kind of significant easing of COVID containment controls. And that, I think, was motivated mostly by the economic picture. She had consolidated power at the top of the Communist Party after the 20th Party Congress in mid to late October. And so there was more political space for him to, address the economic side of things while still maintaining the, zero COVID policy. And I think then we had the protest in, late November, just recently. And that, I think, has fed into a sense that the party's best course of action, and the best course of action for Xi is to, accelerate somewhat this reopening. And this is, part of the Communist Party's playbook for responding to public dissent. It's a bit more sophisticated than it's sometimes understood to be. Yes, there was repression. But there's also often a tactical readjustment of policies to try and address these sources of public grievance. I think that's certainly part of what's happening now with this further relaxation of the zero COVID policy with these new 10 measures just today, China time.
Now, in the past, when we've seen some grievances in China, we really haven't seen the government, in a sense, acquiesce to this. So I do want to ask more about the economic angle, because we did see that China's debt ratio hit a record high. How much pressure is President Xi under right now to really get the economy on track?
I think Xi Jinping has always had a sense of there being a bottom line for growth. He was happy, and he said this explicitly, to make some short-term economic sacrifices to continue with the zero COVID policy. But even to achieve his more political, more nationalist goals for China as a country, that requires a baseline level of economic growth. So I think this is, part of that readjustment for him. There is pressure, not just from the Chinese people, but also, I think, internally from himself and his own goals to ensure that China is still able to grow at a positive rate and to be able to sustain at least, low digit positive growth for the next couple of decades to try and reach, his goal to make China the world's most powerful country by the middle of the century. So I think some of it is responding to protests, perhaps in the timeline being brought forward. But I think it was always in the cards that, Xi, wanted to exit zero COVID policy at some point. And he's going to do it gradually, maybe less gradually than expected, but I think we shouldn't kind of overread the danger for Xi politically. He's still very much in control. This is certainly a proactive measure to try and reduce the political threat of the protests and of any potential economic crises.
Neil, zero COVID, of course, one of many issues facing China right now. Xi Jinping today landing in Riyadh to meet with senior officials over in Saudi Arabia at a time when the U.S. is not only seeing tension with China, but also with Saudi Arabia. What do you make of this meeting and what appears to be more of a warming relationship between China and Saudi Arabia?
I think Xi's trip to Saudi Arabia over the next few days is symbolic of China's increasing diplomatic efforts to portray itself as a leader in the non-Western world and amongst developing countries. That's been an emerging theme of foreign policy under Xi. And it's a response in some ways to the efforts by the Trump and Biden administrations in the United States to rally the West and US allies to cooperate more on policies that are targeted at China and trying to limit the potential for China's military development and even for its technological development too. We just saw with export controls that Biden introduced just a couple of months ago on semiconductors. So we see China pivoting to really investing in its ties with the developing world and in trying to be the kind of leader in kind of swinging some of these countries away from their relations with the United States and ensuring that the coalitions that the United States is able to build against China are going to be limited just to its closest allies and are not going to be able to extend to some of these emerging markets like we see in the Middle East and across Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia.
And Neil, I just want to quickly touch on oil, because when you have the largest exporter of oil in Saudi Arabia meeting with the largest importer of oil in China, what about demand for some of these commodities as these two do forge a closer relationship?
Yeah, I think we're going to see, China try and reduce its dependencies on the West and on other, countries that are subject to Western sanctions, also including Russia now as well. And you're trying to make sure that it has a diversified source of energy imports. And Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, which are going to be meeting with Xi in Saudi Arabia, are really important players. And we've seen Xi emphasize energy security as a rising priority for the Communist Party. That was one of the clear takeaways from the 20th Party Congress report that Xi delivered in October. And it's part of a general push to ensure that economic development in China is balanced with national security considerations, of which energy security is just one of many. And so that's, growth no longer being the sole and only priority. It's still a priority, but ensuring that this national security type of considerations are addressed is, increasingly something that's considered and balanced along with growth. So I think, in terms of the oil markets, this is a potentially significant development. There is a potential for Saudi Arabia to start pricing some oil contracts in renminbi, the Chinese currency. That's that might happen, it might not, but still the fact this conversation is happening and it's a possibility. Maybe we'll see some contracts in other commodities that are introduced first in RMB, but it's just a sign of this cultivation that Beijing is doing of non-Western and emerging markets.